For years, Americans were told that progress was inevitable, that the country's systems, its economy, its infrastructure, its jobs, its cities would keep moving forward no matter what. Growth was the default, stability was expected, and decline was something that only happened somewhere else. But the truth beneath the surface is far different. Across the nation, quiet breakdowns are unfolding in ways most people never notice until the consequences reach their doorstep. A shrinking middle class, debt levels climbing beyond reason, cities hollowing out, jobs disappearing not during recessions, but during periods of so-called growth, an infrastructure network aging faster than it can be repaired, and a food and energy system that's starting to show signs of strain. These aren't isolated problems. They are interconnected shifts forming a larger pattern that suggests America is entering a new era defined not by collapse, but by instability, a slow, uneven unwinding of assumptions that once felt permanent. This isn't about fear, it's about clarity. Because the threats reshaping the country aren't loud, sudden, or cinematic, they are gradual, systemic, and rooted in decades of neglect, technological disruption, and economic pressure building from the bottom up. And while most of these issues remain unspoken in mainstream conversations, their impact is already visible in everyday American life through rising prices, fragile job security, unpredictable services, and a growing sense that something foundational is shifting. This documentary explores those hidden pressures one by one, not to sensationalize them, but to understand them. Because the future isn't defined by a single event, it's shaped by everything happening quietly, all at once. For decades, the American middle class was seen as the backbone of the nation, the living proof of what people called the American dream: a stable job, a home with a yard, a decent car, and a family vacation every summer. That was the promise. But today, that promise is quietly fading. What once defined stability in America is slowly being dismantled, piece by piece, without the public fully realizing it. This isn't a sudden collapse you can see on the evening news. It's a silent erosion, one that's been happening in the background for years, accelerated by inflation, stagnant wages, and an economy that no longer rewards hard work the way it used to. Inflation has become the invisible tax that eats away at every dollar Americans earn. Prices of food, rent, and healthcare have surged, while real wages adjusted for inflation have barely moved. The average American family today earns more on paper than they did 10 years ago, but their money buys less. Groceries cost more. Gas costs more. Childcare costs more. Every part of daily life now demands a bigger slice of their paycheck, leaving almost nothing to save. The illusion of stability is maintained only through debt, credit cards, car loans, personal loans, and increasingly, by now, pay-later apps. The system encourages spending as a form of survival and punishes saving as a form of stagnation. Meanwhile, the dream of homeownership, once a cornerstone of the middle class, has become unreachable for millions. Mortgage rates have hit their highest levels in over 2 decades. Home prices have skyrocketed, not because Americans are buying more, but because institutional investors and hedge funds have entered the market, buying up neighborhoods and renting them back to the very people who can no longer afford to buy. The result is a nation of renters, where even those with good jobs find themselves trapped in a cycle of rent hikes and financial insecurity. The middle class isn't vanishing overnight, it's being priced out of its own future. And while costs have risen, wages haven't kept up. Most Americans today are working longer hours for less real value. A second job, or even a side hustle, has become the new normal just to stay afloat. What used to be considered a comfortable income now barely covers basic needs. The phrase living paycheck to paycheck isn't just a statistic anymore, it's a lifestyle for over 60% of the country. For many, one emergency, a car repair, a medical bill, or a job loss could push them into financial freefall. This slow-motion collapse isn't just about numbers or economic charts, it's psychological. It changes how people see themselves and their future. The middle class used to represent confidence, the belief that if you worked hard, you'd be rewarded. Now it represents anxiety. People work harder than ever, but feel poorer each year. They're not lazy or reckless. They're trapped in an economic system that's quietly recalibrated against them. The sense of security that once defined the middle class has been replaced by a constant, gnawing fear of losing everything. And yet, the system tells them everything is fine. The headlines talk about record job growth and a resilient economy, but that resilience is built on fragile ground. The stock market climbs while personal debt explodes. Corporate profits soar while employees struggle to afford groceries. Productivity rises, but so do burnout and depression. The middle class is still working, but it's working to sustain an economy that no longer sustains them. This is the silent collapse, not an explosion, but an evaporation. A gradual loss of what it means to feel secure in America. It's not just about losing wealth, it's about losing certainty. And by the time most people realize it's happening, they've already been pushed down a rung on the economic ladder, wondering how they fell without ever hearing a sound. America has always been a nation built on credit, a country where borrowing wasn't just normal, but celebrated. It was the engine that fueled economic growth, consumer spending, and the illusion of prosperity. But today, that same engine is overheating. The debt that once empowered Americans has become the very thing suffocating them. And behind closed doors, millions are discovering that they are no longer living with debt, they are living for it. Right now, the United States is facing the highest levels of consumer debt in its history. Credit card balances have crossed thresholds no generation has ever seen. What used to be a financial tool has turned into a lifeline, not for luxury, but for survival. People use credit cards to pay for groceries, medical bills, rent, even gas. The system has quietly shifted from buy now, enjoy later to buy now, or you don't eat. But the most dangerous part isn't the debt itself, it's the cost of carrying it. Credit card interest rates in America have quietly climbed to between 25 and 30% levels once considered predatory. These aren't fringe lenders or shady payday loan shops. These are major banks, billion-dollar institutions backed by the government, charging everyday Americans interest rates once associated with financial desperation, and because inflation has pushed people into relying on credit more than ever. These interest rates are devouring their financial futures one statement at a time. Most Americans don't even realize how fast the trap closes. They make the minimum payment each month, believing they're staying afloat. But minimum payments are designed to keep them in debt for decades. A $1,000 balance can take more than 20 years to pay off at current interest rates. The average American household now pays more in interest than they do for food. This isn't debt management, it's debt servitude. Worse, the system punishes you the moment you struggle. Missed one payment, and the interest rate spikes. Max out a card because groceries are too expensive, and your credit score drops. Your options shrink. Your stress rises. Suddenly, every dollar you earn is already spoken for before it even hits your bank account. You're not working for yourself, you're working for the debt. Millions of Americans today wake up not to build a future, but to avoid falling deeper into a hole they did not create. And still, the culture encourages spending. Ads push easy financing. Banks send pre-approved offers. Retailers offer zero interest for 6 months, knowing most people won't be able to pay it off in time. By now, pay later apps have spread across the country like wildfire, breaking purchases into payments that feel small but add up quickly. These platforms target young adults, especially, turning a generation with stagnant wages into a generation permanently indebted. This is why 2026 could become a breaking point. As inflation stays high and wages fall behind, the borrow-to-survive model becomes impossible to sustain. When people can no longer take on new debt, when they can't make their interest payments, when the minimum payment becomes unmanageable, the trap snaps shut. Not with a dramatic crash, but with millions quietly defaulting, one by one, across the country. The scariest part is that this crisis is invisible. There are no protests, no headlines, debt doesn't make noise. It builds in silence, a weight pressing down on households until something finally gives. It's not a crisis of economics alone, but a crisis of dignity. A country where people work full-time, sometimes 2 jobs, yet still rely on credit just to survive, is a country walking toward a dark threshold. This isn't financial mismanagement. This isn't a spending problem. It's a system designed to profit from struggle. And as the cost of living climbs, the trap becomes unavoidable. In the end, the consumer debt crisis isn't about numbers, it's about millions of Americans, realizing too late that the credit they depended on has become the chain around their future. For most Americans, the banking system feels permanent, a fixed structure that stands above the chaos of everyday life. People trust that their money is safe, that their bank will be there tomorrow, and that the system supporting it is too big, too regulated, and too sophisticated to fail. But underneath that sense of security is a truth most people never see. The foundation of America's banking system is fractured, and the cracks are widening in silence. The biggest danger today isn't coming from Wall Street giants. It's coming from the small and mid-sized regional banks scattered across the country. Banks that hold the savings, mortgages, and business accounts of millions of everyday people. These banks are not failing loudly. They are weakening quietly. They are burdened by a problem almost no one is talking about: the collapse of commercial real estate. Across America, offices sit half empty. Remote work has transformed once bustling downtowns into quiet districts of vacant floors and darkened windows. Shopping malls, once symbols of suburban prosperity, have become hollow shells of their former selves. Retail spaces struggle to survive as consumer habits shift online. And all of these properties, office buildings, malls, commercial complexes, were financed by the same institutions, now struggling to keep their balance sheets intact. Regional banks. When the value of commercial real estate drops, the loans tied to those properties drop with it. Buildings that were worth $50 million 5 years ago might be worth half that today. Tenants have moved out. Businesses have shut down. Landlords can't keep up with payments. And the banks holding those loans are suddenly sitting on billions of dollars in assets that no longer exist in any meaningful sense. This is where the cracks become dangerous. A large national bank can absorb hits like these, a regional bank cannot. They don't have the balance sheet strength, the liquidity, or the political protection. And unlike the big institutions, they don't make headlines when they begin to falter. Their decline happens quietly in the background, until one day, customers wake up to news that their local bank has been seized, merged, or shut down. The real threat is not one bank failing. It's the chain reaction that follows. Regional banks are deeply interconnected. When one begins to collapse, confidence in others begins to erode. Depositors move their money to bigger institutions. Small banks lose liquidity. They tighten lending. Businesses become starved of credit. Jobs disappear. Communities suffer. A single failure becomes a signal, a warning that spreads faster than the system can contain. We saw a glimpse of this in 2023 when a few mid-sized banks collapsed almost overnight, triggering panic and emergency intervention. But that was a surface-level event, a preview, not the full picture. The underlying problem today is far larger and more systemic. This time, it's not driven by a sudden shock. It's driven by a slow, relentless decay in asset value that will keep dragging regional banks down for years. What makes this crisis especially dangerous is how invisible it is to the public. Banks don't advertise their weaknesses. They don't announce when their portfolios lose value. They don't warn customers when they're quietly selling assets at a loss or taking emergency loans from the Federal Reserve. On the outside, everything looks normal, but inside, thousands of small banks are fighting a losing battle against a commercial real estate market that may never return to pre-pandemic levels. If the cracks continue widening, 2026 could become the year Americans face a banking landscape unlike anything they've seen before, one where local banks vanish, small businesses struggle to access credit, and entire communities lose the financial infrastructure they depend on. This isn't a crisis of the big banks. It's a crisis of the many small ones, the institutions that hold up the real economy. And the most alarming part is that the system can crumble long before the public ever realizes the foundation was broken. For generations, the American housing market was predictable. Prices rose, prices fell, and the cycle repeated itself every decade or so. A boom ended in a bust. A bust eventually gave way to recovery. But today, the country is staring at a housing crisis unlike anything in its history. A freeze. Not a crash, not a surge, but a complete paralysis where nothing moves, nothing changes, and nothing makes sense. The heart of the freeze is one simple number: mortgage rates at 7 to 8%. It's a level the modern middle class isn't built to handle. For years, Americans grew accustomed to ultra-low interest rates. A mortgage at 2.5 or 3% wasn't a luxury. It was normal. It shaped how people calculated affordability, how families planned for the future, and how the entire housing ecosystem functioned. But when those rates doubled, the market didn't adjust. It stopped. Homeowners locked into low rates refuse to sell. Why would they trade a 2.8% mortgage for one nearly 3 times as expensive? Selling their home doesn't mean moving up, it means moving backward, paying far more for less, so they stay put. They freeze. They wait, hoping rates will fall again, even though no one knows when or if that will happen. On the other side are the buyers, young families, first-time homeowners, and middle-class workers dreaming of stability. But with mortgage rates at 7 to 8% and prices still historically high, affordability collapses. A home that cost $2,000 a month just a few years ago now costs $3,500 or more. Wages haven't risen to match this reality. Down payments have become impossible to save. Every step forward leads to a wall that keeps getting taller. The result is a market where both sides are stuck. Sellers won't sell, buyers can't buy. Banks aren't lending at the volume they used to. Real estate agents are watching their listings dry up. Construction companies are pulling back. The gears of the market, once always grinding, always moving, are stiffening. This isn't a healthy slowdown. It's a full system stagnation. But the most dangerous misconception is believing this is just another bubble waiting to burst. In reality, it's something far more insidious, a bubble that's rotting slowly from the inside. Prices aren't crashing because there's no forced selling. Homeowners with low rates can afford to wait forever. Investors with cash can hold properties indefinitely. There's no panic, no fire sale, no dramatic collapse. Instead, the market decays quietly as affordability gets worse, inventory gets tighter, and the dream of homeownership drifts further out of reach. This slow rot is reshaping the country in ways people don't fully see yet. A locked market means fewer families moving to new jobs. It means young adults staying with parents longer. It means entire neighborhoods aging in place while new communities fail to grow. Mobility, economic, geographic, and social begins to collapse. The American housing market, once a driver of national momentum, becomes an anchor dragging the economy down. And still, the prices stay high. That's what confuses people the most. How can the housing market be dying if home values keep rising on paper? The truth is simple. Price is no longer a reflection of demand. It's a reflection of scarcity, a scarcity created by fear, uncertainty, and financial immobility. Homes aren't worth more because the country is thriving. They're worth more because no one is willing or able to move. This is a freeze that breaks confidence, not buildings. It reshapes the system without announcing itself. And by the time Americans realize what's happening, homeownership will have quietly shifted from a realistic milestone of middle-class life to a luxury, reserved for the few who can pay cash or weather the storm of high rates. The market won't explode, it will hollow out. For decades, Americans were warned that automation would take away physical labor, factory lines, warehouse jobs, routine manufacturing. But that prediction misunderstood the real threat. The next wave of job displacement isn't coming for the working class. It's coming for the white-collar backbone of America. The accountants, the analysts, the designers, the supervisors, the support specialists, the very people who once believed they were safe because they worked behind a desk instead of on a factory floor. The rise of artificial intelligence has rewritten the rules of the labor market. What began as a tool to assist workers has evolved into a system that replaces them. AI no longer just organizes data, it interprets it. It no longer just answers questions, it solves problems. It no longer just speeds up tasks, it completes entire workloads on its own. And as companies discover how much time and money they save by deploying AI, the incentive to keep large white-collar workforces weakens overnight. This shift is unlike any job disruption America has seen. In the past, technological change created new opportunities as quickly as it eliminated old ones. The Industrial Revolution reduced some roles but created entire industries. But today, AI doesn't need new workers to operate. It doesn't require training, benefits, healthcare, or time off. It scales instantly, works without limits, and improves with every update. For corporations, the economic logic is undeniable and devastating. Accountants who once handled mountains of paperwork now watch software complete entire audits in seconds. Customer support agents find their positions replaced by automated systems that can handle thousands of queries simultaneously. Basic graphic design, once a stable entry-level career, can now be replicated by AI in seconds, generating endless variations at no additional cost. Data analysts, once valued for their ability to interpret complex patterns, are discovering that AI can uncover insights faster than they can read a spreadsheet. The threat isn't hypothetical, it's happening now. Companies across the country are quietly restructuring their workforces, reducing hiring, and letting go of employees whose roles can be automated. Yet the public rarely hears about it because this displacement doesn't create dramatic layoffs or shuttered factories. Instead, it happens quietly, through hiring freezes, reduced hours, and positions that simply vanish when someone resigns. America presents itself as a global superpower, a nation of towering skylines, vast highways, and technological dominance. But beneath the surface of that image lies a truth most people avoid confronting. The country is running on infrastructure that is far older, far weaker, and far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. The United States entered the 21st century with the bones of the 20th, and now those bones are starting to crack. Much of the essential infrastructure Americans rely on every single day was built decades ago. Water systems designed in the 1950s, bridges constructed during the Eisenhower era, electrical grids that were never meant to withstand modern demand. These aging systems weren't built for today's population, today's climate, or today's technology. Yet they continue carrying the weight of a nation that keeps growing while the foundation beneath it slowly decays. The cracks no longer hide themselves. Water mains explode under city streets, flooding neighborhoods and shutting down entire blocks. Bridges develop fractures and require emergency closures. Electrical grids buckle during heat waves and winter storms, leaving millions in darkness. Each incident exposes how vulnerable the system has become, not because of bad luck, but because the country has delayed maintenance for so long that failure is no longer a possibility. It's an expectation. Nowhere is this fragility more evident than in America's power grid. It is a patchwork of outdated lines, overloaded substations, and equipment long past its intended lifespan. As energy demand rises and climate extremes intensify, the grid is pushed to its breaking point. Rolling blackouts, once rare, are becoming routine. Wildfires sparked by failing power lines ravage entire regions. Storms that should be manageable instead bring down critical systems for days. This isn't a problem of inconvenience. It's a problem of national stability. A country cannot function when water systems fail, when electricity becomes unreliable, when transportation networks crumble under their own age. Every collapse, no matter how localized, sends ripples through the economy. Businesses lose inventory. Hospitals switch to emergency generators. Supply chains get disrupted. Millions lose trust in institutions that were supposed to protect them. What makes this crisis especially dangerous is how quietly it grows. Infrastructure doesn't sound an alarm as it decays. Pipes corrode silently beneath the ground. Steel beams weaken without warning. Electrical components overheat invisibly until the moment they fail. The deterioration happens out of sight, creating an illusion of stability that lasts right up until the second it's shattered. Experts warn that 2026 could be a turning point, not because the systems suddenly become older, but because the strain placed on them continues increasing while investment continues falling behind. By 2026, millions more electric vehicles will be on the roads, climate events will be more frequent and extreme. The population will be larger, the grid will be carrying more load, the water systems will be under more pressure, and the aging components that once had margin for error will have none left. America's infrastructure problem is not that it's collapsing all at once, but that it's collapsing in slow motion, piece by piece, community by community. And because the failures don't happen at the same time, the nation treats them as isolated incidents. A blackout here, a bridge closure there, a water crisis in another city. But each event is part of the same story, a superpower running on borrowed time. The world sees the United States as a country of innovation and progress. But behind that image is a reality. Americans are beginning to experience firsthand a nation whose physical foundation has aged past its limit. A nation where the next major failure isn't a question of if, but when. And unless the country acknowledges the urgency of this moment, the infrastructure time bomb ticking beneath America will continue counting down toward a future that looks far more unstable than most people expect. For years, Americans assumed the food system was the one thing that would always remain stable. Grocery stores fully stocked, produce from every season, prices predictable, maybe rising, slowly but never suddenly enough to disrupt daily life. That expectation was built on decades of smooth logistics, cheap fertilizer, favorable weather, and a global supply chain operating like a well-oiled machine. But that era is breaking down, quietly. And the warning signs are already here, scattered across the country. None of them are dramatic enough on their own to trigger national panic. But together, they form a pattern that experts have been trying to raise the alarm about, one that most people prefer not to look at too closely. The real threat is not a food shortage. It's volatility, violent price swings, unpredictable availability, and sudden regional disruptions that hit households directly through their grocery bills. And everything starts with the weather. Across the Midwest, extreme heat waves and shifting rainfall patterns have been hitting corn and soybean yields in ways that used to be considered rare anomalies. What used to be a 1 in 10 years drought is beginning to feel like a 2 or 3 times a decade event. Farmers are forced to choose between replanting, absorbing losses, or abandoning fields altogether. The ripple effects move from farms to suppliers to supermarkets, and eventually to American families who suddenly find staples costing more than they did just months ago. Then there's fertilizer. The price spikes that happened in recent years didn't fully go away, they just stopped being talked about. But farmers still pay significantly more today than they did a decade ago. Higher fertilizer costs translate to higher production costs. Higher production costs translate to higher retail prices. Simple, but unavoidable. And as global fertilizer supply becomes more vulnerable to geopolitical tensions and energy prices, that instability flows directly into U.S. grocery costs. Transportation is another fault line. Trucking shortages, aging rail lines, and port congestion mean food has become more expensive to move, not because America can't produce enough, but because moving food from point A to point B has become a fragile and inconsistent process. When one part of the chain breaks, whether it's a bridge closure, a storm hitting a distribution hub, or a strike, the shock radiates outward. Suddenly, a grocery store in Arizona is missing eggs. A supermarket in Washington sees beef prices jump overnight. Florida reports a shortage of certain vegetables for weeks at a time. Individually, these feel like isolated problems. Collectively, they point to a food supply losing its buffers. Finally, failed harvests in specific regions: California's vegetable fields, Texas cattle ranches, Florida citrus groves, Trigger cascading effects. America is a superpower, but even a superpower can't escape the consequences of climate extremes and infrastructure stress. When one region goes down, the rest of the country pays for it in the form of higher prices and tighter supply. This isn't about empty shelves, it's about instability becoming normal. Prices that jump 20% in a season, products that vanish for a week, then reappear overpriced. Families adjusting diets not out of choice, but necessity. That's the food supply shock no one wants to talk about. Not dramatic enough to make headlines, but serious enough to hit every wallet in the country. The danger isn't that America runs out of food. The danger is that Americans lose the ability to predict what food will cost next month. And that instability changes everything.